Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be looking at Tamiya's 1/48 scale ME262. This was my first ever German aircraft and German camouflage scheme, so I hope you enjoy. So we begin this kit by building up the cockpit tub. The first call of action is to put these two side control panels into the cockpit. They have some nice little location tabs, so there's no problem fitting them in. The back wall of the cockpit is then cemented on. Once again, features nice prominent location tabs, so you're not going to have any issue there. I then whipped out my tweezers and put in the rather small rudder pedals, however they went in really nicely. There's then a couple of other small bits and bobs, I'm not too sure what they are, but they look to be maybe circuit breakers or something like that, that have to be put into the cockpit tub. There's no surprises here, they all go in really nicely indeed. Another nice feature was a one-piece seat, just because sometimes you have manufacturers who make you build up this seat and it has about 1500 parts to it and you just get a little bit overwhelmed, but this was a nice one piece. So the control panel is slotted into the cockpit tub. I didn't cement it in there just because I wanted to pull it out afterwards and do some detail painting on it, but it was slotted in there just so it could be painted at the same time as the rest of the cockpit. So the cockpit was painted in that grey that I just showed you on screen. As I did say, this is my first ever German kit, so I was a little bit unsure on the colours, however I thought this was quite a good match. After the base coat was down, I then picked out a couple of the raised details with some whites and some reds and a very small brush. Tamiya do not supply decal for the side panels, so this is the only way that you can do it. I'm not complaining because I personally do prefer to paint my control panels and my instrument panels. Tamiya do actually supply a decal for all of their instruments, however I thought I'm going to follow the theme, keep it continuous and just paint it. So here I am just painting the all of the gauges and stuff in a black, and then I will come in with a really fine tip brush and just put some white squiggles on a couple of them, as you can see, to represent a couple of the gauges and instruments, altitude indicator, you name it. I tried to recreate it. After that was done, it was then slotted back into the cockpit tub, and that was pretty much the assembly done. The final bit which I thought I would add was a bit of chipping. I'm using a sponge chipping technique here. So what you do is you get a little bit of sponge, you dip it in a bit of metallic or whatever colour you want to be chipping in, and then you very lightly just dab. It's much easier to use than chipping fluid, and I think it looks more realistic than if you were to try and paint the chips by hand. However, I tried to keep this continuous throughout the entirety of the cockpit, so a couple of the other aspects which I thought might be seen, I also made sure to chip them up. I've just remembered I forgot to disclose what metallic paint I'm using here. I'm using Ammo MIG's metallic range, and I think I'm using their steel colour. I did also use their steel colour for the interior here, or the interior and also the gear bay, just because they're easy to use and they're easy to clean up, and when I'm not looking for a super shiny finish which won't be seen too much, they're my go-to paint. So when I was painting the interior of the two fuselage halves and also doing a bit of chipping, I made sure to paint a couple of the sidewalls in the metallic colour as well. These are then cemented onto either side of the cockpit tub, and then this sub-assembly is cemented into one side of the fuselage halves. Nice fit here, nice and snug. However, it is quite hard to see any visible sort of alignment pins or anything. However, just make sure you refer to the instructions, do a couple of dry fit tests, and you'll be absolutely fine. It was then time to move on to the gun bay. You might be wondering that this is a pretty shocking gun bay, painting wise, not actual detail wise, and it's because I knew I was not going to display it in the open position. You can display it in the open position, however I had heard some horror stories about the panel that is meant to show it to be open not fitting correctly and completely ruining a kit, so I thought I'd play it safe and just completely enclose it all in. This sub-assembly is then cemented on top of a very nice metal nose weight. I was very happy to see this included in the kit. It just you know, it just puts my mind at rest and not having to worry about trying to find a place to put in any nose weight. So another sub-assembly that has to be connected onto this is the nose wheel piece, and me being me, absolute melon, didn't read the instructions, so I put this on the wrong way. I did resurrect the issue, but as you can see, if you don't put it on in the right orientation, then this part just does not go into the gear bay correctly. So luckily I did a lot of dry fitting and I was like, this is not right, this is not right. So after about 20 minutes I resulted back to the instructions, and I looked at it was the wrong way around. So don't do what I did. But once that is all cemented in the right way around, it clicks into this fuselage with no issues. Then the two fuselage halves can be cemented together. This is not your usual Tamiya fit. It has a little bit of quite, you know, more pronounced seams than usual. I'm not saying that it's a bad fit, but it isn't up to maybe modern day Tamiya kit quality. However, once that was all cemented together and dried, and I'd done a bit of rescribing and filling, it was then time to move on to the wheel bay. So the wheel bay is made up like your usual sort of configuration, with a couple of sidewalls and everything. This was then all sprayed in, once again, an ammo MIG metallic colour, and then the top halves of the wings can be cemented on. These are pretty good. Once again, I think this is an older tooling of Tamiya, so it definitely isn't what you would expect from maybe a very modern day one. However, this being said, the fit is still very tight. Look at this, a lovely little snap. Wait for it, wait for it. Oof, brilliant, brilliant. Love to see a good snap. And you know, there's no huge modifications that need to be made to this kit to make it look good. I then focused my attention to the rear half of the airplane, mainly focusing on the horizontal stabilizers and also the rudder. These, you know, once again, they follow the same sort of trend. They've got nice location tabs, so you're not going to run into any surprises here. And, you know, they feel solid enough that you can not have to worry about bumping them off. So I, once again, was a little bit of a melon, and I put the wrong rudder onto the kit. However, it's fine. I just ripped it off and put the other one in, and it seemed to we didn't seem to do any damage, so I just moved on to these two underside bits. I'm not too sure what they are. I'm not too sure why they were molded as separate bits, but we go with the flow, we move on. A couple of other panels and stuff now is the final sort of bits. You always get to this part of a build where it's just putting it feels like hundreds of panels onto an aircraft. They all went down okay. This front section was a little bit, I'm going to say a little bit steppy, like there are a couple of steps in a couple of the panels, but it's nothing too noticeable. I'm sure when you get to the final photos, if you really, you know, focus your attention onto the front portion of the fuselage, you might be able to see a couple of steps, but to me it wasn't too bad. So moving on to the engines, these went together relatively okay. Most ME262 kits, their major flaw usually lies around this part of the kit. However, I was quite happy that you know, I don't think I could ask for much more out of these engines, except for when they are being mounted onto the actual aircraft, but we'll get to that when we get to it. There were about 3 sub-assemblies which all kind of get smushed into one, and then the first 2 sub-assemblies go onto the wing, and then you have to fit the third one afterwards. It's a little bit confusing, but I actually read the instructions this time, so we didn't have any major issues, but there was one small one, but that comes in later. So with the engines all complete and stuck onto the aircraft, I went on to the last couple of assemblies. If anyone can explain to me why I had to put another transparent piece within a transparent piece, I would love to know. My initial theory was something to do with maybe armoured glass in the front bit, but anyway, the other bits of the clear and transparent parts, they were all masked off just using some of Ammo's masking fluid. This was a mistake. Do not copy this. I'll get into why it was a mistake later on in the video, but the reason for me doing this was purely because I could not find or could not see or feel much of the raised details for the frame, and if I'm using my usual masking technique, it relies very heavily on having raised seams and lines to make the mask off of. I could only do this on the front section, which is why you can see a bit of masking tape there. Whilst I was blabbering on about maskings and everything, you see me doing a bit of surgery on one of the engines and just trying to blend it into the wing, just because it was quite a big step and I didn't like how it looked. The final touches before I start to get a bit of paint on this beast is pretty much just to use some sponges to mask off a couple of the gear bays and other areas which I don't want paint to get into. For primers, I'm using my usual Ammo's one-shot primer. However, this probably is one of the last times I'm going to be using the primer, as I'm running out and I want to try some different primers. This was blasted onto the model at about 30 psi with a 0.4 needle. So the first colour that I sprayed down was Ammo Mig's Hella Blau. The Hella Blau colour. As you can see, my German pronunciations really aren't very good. However, this was sprayed at about 25 psi with a 0.4 needle. You might, if you have watched the channel before, be wondering, oh, he isn't using a mottle like the usual mottle technique, what is happening? So I believe I'm using a technique called black basing here, and what black basing is very similar to your mottle effect. However, you mottle with the colour that is going to go on top of the mottle, or usually the mottle coat. The reason for me doing this is because I didn't want to have an incredibly harsh looking model. So if you use black basing, your tonal variations are going to be a little bit more subtle than when you would use you know, very deep looking colours like different blues and reds to try and bring out different tones. So that is my reasoning behind doing that, and the mottle was put down and then it's built up with thinner layers. My lighting wasn't brilliant here, so it looks like I chuck on the paint with bucket loads, but it is actually quite thin coats, so I'll try and work on that for next time. However, I did want to make sure that it was quite a solid coat, especially on the side that I was just painting, purely because there is a mottle, an actual mottle pattern that is part of the camouflage, and in my head I was thinking it might not look as solid and as as effective looking if you have a really patchy undercoat, so I might have tried to go for a bit more of a solid representation for the side bits of the aircraft. So I use this exact same technique now, but with the other two colours. I made sure to put the little dropper bottle image on the bottom left hand side of the screen for you, and I also masked. The German camouflage seemed to be more of a splinter camouflage, so I thought I definitely cannot freehand this, even though I love to freehand my camouflage. So what I did was use just your bog standard Tamiya masking tape and kind of did it by eye. Before I put the masking tape down onto the model, as you can see, it isn't very sticky. I pretty much put it on a bit of paper and ripped it off a couple of times just to get rid of the tackiness, to make sure I didn't peel off any of the underlying coats, especially as I was going to be painting and masking on relatively freshly dried paint. So it was then onto the mottle pattern. I didn't know what to expect when trying to do mottling. I'd watched a couple of videos in the past and also had a look at a couple of reference images, and before I even started to do any of the mottle on this subject, I had a scrap bit of paper where I was just practicing trying to do a couple of the common shapes which I found, which were more blobby and they have like kind of bits ricocheting off of them. My general tip for you, however, these tips are coming from someone who's only now made one German model, is to not think about what you're doing. The mottle seems to be a very, very random camouflage, so literally just have a bit of music on in the background and just squiggle around, but try to keep the squiggles to a general sort of size. The thing that I would say is all mottle I saw, they seem to follow quite a regular sort of size. Like, it's not like there's one huge one and then like 15 tiny ones. they follow quite a similar sort of size. So those are my mottling tips for you. And another mottle tip is when I was doing the mottle, my air pressure was actually lower. It was more like 22, 23 psi, and that just gives you a little more control over everything. And with the mottle done, it was time to do a couple more elements of painting. So the scheme that I chose had or featured a red nose, so I made sure to paint that. And then it was on to a couple of sub-assemblies again. So here you can see me working on the gear legs and also the gear bay doors and everything that are attached to the leg. These were all painted up in the exact same way as I have just previously shown you, just to make sure that continuity, there we go, is followed throughout the build. These actually went together really nicely. There's really quite nicely placed they're like pins most of the time actually, and I don't know, they just went together a lot easier than usual usual gear go together. As you can see, there's also really nice sturdy tabs and, you know, location places to put the gear, so you will not run into any issues here when with your gear collapsing or any proper issues. I've said issues a lot now, so I'm going to stop saying issues. With the last gear legs all cemented on, it was then time to put a gloss varnish down. I'm using VMS's gloss varnish before I put the decals down. A gloss varnish is always good to help adhere the decals to the surface. These decals were actually quite good, especially as they are Tamiya. However, I wasn't going to risk it. I didn't put all of the stencils on. I think I put 1 or 2 stencils on, but I have PTSD for Tamiya decals, as you will find out in an upcoming video. One of my projects has been put on hold purely because of Tamiya decals, so that's a little hint for you. But once all the decals were down, I then gave it a matte varnish. Once the matte varnish was down, I could do a bit of weathering. So my initial bit of weathering that I wanted to do with oils was to just create some tonal variations. To do this, I'm using a white oil paint, so I will put a couple of blobs down, then I bring in you know, just some saturate to saturate the color with some white spirit. As you can see, it kind of spreads out, and then I will have a bit of a blending brush and try to blend it in. I do this just to define a couple of the panels a bit more. I don't think there's any actual reason for this, but it just helps make a couple of aspects of the model pop. I also did, as you can see in the top right there, a bit of streaking. I did a bit of streaking on the underside as well. If you want to know how I did this, I didn't film it purely because in a recent video I went into much more depth on how I do it, the F16 aggressor video. So if you want to figure out how I do all the streaking, that would be a very good place to start. All of my weathering effects were then sealed in with another layer of matte varnish, and then the masks were peeled off. Here you can see why masking fluid was a mistake. It just didn't give me very good borders. So to rectify this issue, I got a cocktail stick, I slammed it on my desk to get rid of the pointy bit, and then I just very slowly scraped off any of the excess. You can also see at the top there on the wing surface there's a bit of bobbly stuff. Not too sure what that's from. However, this was just sorted out by using a very high grit sanding sponge and just slowly sanding it out. And with that, the model was done. However, beforehand, I do just have a little announcement to make. This is a German aircraft, so there is a certain symbol on this aircraft that might be offensive to some viewers. So I do apologise, and I tried my best to not focus on it. But without any further ado, I hope you enjoy the final photos, and I'll see you again soon.